The wind howled through the skeletal pines like a dying animal, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something wild and ancient that made Alice's skin prickle beneath her wool coat. Her breath came in sharp puffs as she hefted another log from the pile, the bark rough and cold against her palms. The half-built cabin stood before her like a broken promise, its frame incomplete, gaps yawning where walls should be. Winter was coming fast to this God-forsaken stretch of Montana territory, and she was running out of time. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her desperation. 6 months along and still trying to build a home with her own 2 hands. Thomas would have called her a fool. But Thomas was dead, buried back in Kansas with all her other mistakes. Out here there was only the endless sky, the unforgiving cold, and the strange feeling that something watched her from the tree line. Alice wiped sweat from her brow despite the bitter air. The sensation crawled up her spine again, eyes on her back, patient and predatory. She'd felt it for days now, ever since she'd started clearing this land. When she turned, there was nothing but shadows dancing between the pines, but the feeling never left. The forest held its breath, waiting. She hefted the axe and split another log, the crack echoing across the clearing like a gunshot. Whatever was out there could damn well wait. She had work to do. The beam was heavier than it looked. Alice wrapped her arms around the rough timber, her fingers already numb from the cold, and tried to lift. The wood barely budged. She adjusted her grip, planted her feet wider, and pulled with everything she had. Pain shot through her lower back, and the baby pressed hard against her lungs, stealing her breath. "Come on," she whispered through gritted teeth. The beam might as well have been carved from stone. She tried again, muscles straining, sweat beading on her forehead despite the frigid air that turned her breath to fog. The timber shifted an inch, maybe 2, before her strength gave out entirely. It crashed back to the ground with a bone-jarring thud that sent shockwaves up through her boots. Alice stumbled backward, one hand pressed to her rounded belly, the other braced against her aching spine. The baby rolled and kicked, disturbed by her exertion. Tears of frustration burned her eyes, freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. "Damn you, Thomas," she said to the empty air. "Damn you for leaving me here." The wind picked up, sending loose snow swirling around her feet. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, or maybe it was just the wind through the canyon. She couldn't tell anymore. Everything sounded like death out here. She looked at the beam lying useless in the dirt, then at the skeletal frame of her cabin. Without that support timber, the whole structure would collapse under the first heavy snow. And snow was coming. She could smell it in the air, metallic and sharp. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood. Alice gathered what tools she could carry and trudged toward the canvas tent that served as her temporary shelter. Tomorrow she'd figure out how to move that beam. She had to. Alice woke to silence so complete it felt like death. No wind, no creaking branches, nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing in the cold air. Something was wrong. The morning light filtering through the canvas was too bright, too clean. She pushed herself up on her elbows, every muscle in her body protesting from yesterday's failed labor. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her tension. Outside, not even the birds were singing. Alice pulled on her boots and coat, then pushed through the tent flap into the crisp morning air. The sight that greeted her stopped her cold. The beam, the massive timber she couldn't budge yesterday, was in place. Not just lifted, but perfectly positioned and secured with joints so precise they looked like the work of a master carpenter. The entire frame of her cabin had been completed overnight, walls rising clean and true toward the sky. Her hands shook as she approached the structure. The wood was still fresh, sap gleaming gold in the morning light. But every joint was perfect, every angle square. This wasn't possible. She'd tried for hours yesterday to move that single beam, and now her entire cabin stood nearly finished. "What the hell?" she whispered, running her fingers along a support post. The wood was warm to the touch despite the freezing air. That's when she saw them. Footprints in the snow. Not boots like hers, but something else. Bare feet, impossibly large, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The tracks circled her tent 3 times before leading off into the forest. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movement. Whatever had done this, whatever had built her cabin in a single night, was still out there, still watching. "I know you're there." Alice's voice carried across the clearing, stronger than she felt. The morning sun cast long shadows between the pines, and every one of them could hide a threat. "I know you've been watching me." Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, from the deepest shadows at the forest's edge, he stepped forward. He was tall, taller than any man had a right to be, with dark hair that caught the light like spilled ink. His clothes were simple, well made, but it was his face that stopped her heart. Beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. All sharp angles and pale skin that seemed to glow in the morning light. But it was his eyes that held her frozen, ancient, knowing, and completely inhuman. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice low and rough like whiskey over gravel. "Not in your condition." Alice's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Henry." He took a step closer, moving with a predator's fluid grace. "And I want to help you." "Help me?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "By sneaking around in the dark? By building my cabin without permission?" "You were going to freeze." His eyes never left hers. "You and the child both." The certainty in his voice sent ice through her veins. "How do you know about—" "I can hear its heartbeat." Henry's gaze dropped to her belly, then back to her face. "Strong. Healthy. It deserves to live." Alice backed toward her tent, but Henry was already moving, closing the distance between them with impossible speed. Not running, just suddenly there, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, smell the pine and winter on his skin. "Don't run from me, Alice." Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I won't hurt you." "How do you know my name?" Henry's smile was sad and ancient. "I've been watching over you since you arrived, making sure you're safe." "Safe from what?" "From everything else that hunts in these mountains." Before Alice could respond, Henry's head snapped toward the forest, his entire body going rigid. A growl rumbled low in his chest, a sound no human throat could make. "Get inside," he said, his voice sharp with command. "Now! What's wrong? What's out there?" Henry's eyes began to glow, pale and terrible in the morning light. When he looked at her again, she saw fangs gleaming behind his lips. "Something that wants you dead." The howl that rose from the forest wasn't quite wolf, wasn't quite human. It was answered by another, then another. until the mountains rang with inhuman voices. Henry stepped between Alice and the sound, his body coiled like a spring. "The tent," he said without turning. "Get inside and don't come out until I tell you." Alice stumbled backward, her heart racing. "What are you?" Henry's smile was all teeth and shadows. "Your guardian angel." The howls grew closer, and Henry's eyes blazed brighter, casting pale light across the snow. He reached for her with hands that were no longer quite human, claws extending from his fingertips. "Trust me," he whispered as the forest erupted with movement. "Let me protect you." Alice felt herself falling into those glowing eyes as inhuman shapes burst from the tree line, and Henry's arms closed around her like a promise of salvation and damnation both. The shapes that burst from the tree line weren't wolves. They were something far worse. Twisted creatures with 2 long limbs and eyes that burned like coals, they moved with unnatural speed through the snow. But Henry was faster. He released Alice and spun toward the attackers, his body changing as he moved. His clothes tore as muscles expanded, his spine elongated, and when he roared his challenge, it shook snow from the pine boughs. The creatures skidded to a halt at the edge of the clearing, suddenly, uncertain. "Mine." Henry's voice was barely recognizable, deeper now, resonating with power that made Alice's bones ache. "She is under my protection." The lead creature, something that might have once been human, bared rows of needle-sharp teeth. "The exile speaks of protection. You have no authority here, fallen prince." Henry's laugh was like breaking glass. "I need no crown to tear you apart." The battle was swift and brutal. Henry moved like liquid death, claws and fangs finding their marks with surgical precision. The creature's shrieks echoed off the mountains before dying to wet gurgles. Within moments, only Henry remained standing, his chest heaving, dark blood staining the snow around him. Alice pressed herself against the tent. One hand clutched to her belly where the baby kicked frantically. When Henry turned to her, his eyes were still glowing, his face still partially transformed, but his voice was gentle again. "They're gone. You're safe now." "What were those things?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Henry's features slowly returned to human, though the otherworldly beauty remained. "Corrupted ones. They feed on life force. Yours would have sustained them through the winter." He wiped blood from his claws before they retracted. "They won't return." Alice stared at him, this impossible man who had just saved her life. "And what are you?" "Something that should terrify you." Henry's smile was rueful. "But I hope it doesn't." The morning sun climbed higher, warming Alice's face as she watched Henry work. His movements were fluid, economical, lifting massive timbers as if they weighed nothing. The cabin walls rose with impossible speed, each board fitting perfectly into place. She sat on a makeshift stool, mending a torn shirt, stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. He always was. "How long have you been alone out here?" Alice asked, threading her needle through the worn fabric. Henry paused in his hammering, a nail held between his lips. "Longer than you've been alive." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give." He drove the nail home with a single blow. "Time moves differently for my kind." Alice set down her mending. "Your kind? You mean there are others like you?" "Not like me, no." Henry's jaw tightened. "I'm what you might call unique." The way he said it made her chest ache. She'd heard that tone before, in her own voice when people asked about Thomas, about why she'd come west alone. The sound of someone carrying too much weight. "Unique how?" Henry was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I was born to rule. Instead, I chose exile. Alice felt the baby shift, pressing against her ribs. Rule what? A kingdom you've never heard of. A people who would rather see me dead than on the throne. Henry's hands stilled on the timber. I gave it up for love. She died anyway. The pain in his voice was raw, immediate, as if the wound were fresh. Alice found herself standing, moving toward him without conscious thought. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was centuries ago. Henry's smile was bitter. I've had time to make peace with my choices. Have you? Their eyes met across the half-built cabin. In the golden afternoon light, Henry looked almost human, just a man building a home for a woman who needed shelter. But Alice could see the wildness lurking beneath his skin, the predator that had torn apart those creatures without hesitation. No, he admitted quietly. I don't think I have. Alice reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. His skin was fever-warm despite the cold air. Then maybe it's time you did. Henry stared down at her hand on his arm. When he looked up, something had shifted in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or hunger. Alice, don't. She stepped closer, close enough to smell pine sap and something uniquely him. Don't tell me why this is impossible. I've had enough impossible things happen to last a lifetime. You don't understand what I am, what being near me means. I understand that you saved my life, that you're building me a home when you could have just walked away. Alice's free hand moved to her belly. That you're the first person in months to look at me like I'm more than just a burden to be pitied. Henry's hand covered hers, his fingers intertwining with her smaller ones. You could never be a burden. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Alice felt her heart racing, not from fear this time, but from something she'd thought died with Thomas. Henry was dangerous. She knew that with bone-deep certainty. But he was also gentle, careful with her in a way that made her feel precious instead of fragile. The roof needs finishing, Henry said finally, though he made no move to step away. Then finish it. Alice smiled up at him. I'll make us something to eat. As the days passed, they fell into an easy rhythm. Henry worked on the cabin with supernatural efficiency, while Alice tended the fire, cooked their simple meals, and watched him move with that fluid grace that never quite looked human. They talked while he worked, about the land, about survival, about everything except the growing tension between them. Alice found herself looking forward to the evenings most of all, when Henry would sit beside the fire, and she would curl up nearby, close enough to feel his warmth. He would tell her stories of distant places, of mountains that touched the sky and forests older than memory. His voice would grow soft in the firelight, and Alice would catch herself imagining what it would feel like to have those strong arms around her, to press her face against his chest, and listen to whatever passed for a heartbeat in his kind. On the fourth day, Henry was securing the roof beams when Alice decided to climb up and help. The ladder was sturdy enough, and she was tired of being useless while he did all the work. Alice, no. Henry's voice was sharp with alarm as she started up the rungs. The ladder isn't safe for... I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she called back, pulling herself higher. I can help. The wood was slippery with morning frost, and Alice's boots weren't made for climbing. She made it halfway up before her foot slipped. The world tilted sideways, gravity claiming her with vicious certainty. She had time for one terrified gasp before Henry's arms closed around her, impossibly fast, impossibly strong. He'd moved from the roof to catch her in the space of a heartbeat, cradling her against his chest as they both crashed to the ground. They landed hard, Henry taking the brunt of the impact. Alice found herself sprawled across his chest, her hands fisted in his shirt, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked frantically, disturbed by the sudden motion. "Are you hurt?" Henry's hands moved over her carefully, checking for injuries. "The baby. We're fine." Alice pushed herself up on her elbows, looking down into his worried face. "You caught us. I couldn't let you fall." His voice was rough, strained. "I couldn't." Alice saw the moment his control cracked, saw the careful distance he'd maintained crumble like sand. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. "Alice." He whispered her name like a prayer. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. "Henry." When she opened them again, his face was inches from hers. She could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel his breath warm against her lips. The world narrowed to just this, his hands on her face, the solid warmth of his body beneath hers, the way he looked at her like she was something miraculous. "I shouldn't," Henry said, but his thumbs were still stroking her skin. "Neither should I." Alice's voice was barely a whisper, "But I'm going to anyway." She kissed him. It was supposed to be soft, gentle, a simple press of lips. Instead, it ignited something desperate in both of them. Henry's arms tightened around her, pulling her closer as his mouth moved against hers with centuries of longing. Alice melted into him, her hands tangling in his dark hair, every nerve ending singing with want. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Henry's eyes had that otherworldly glow again, and Alice could feel the barely leashed power thrumming beneath his skin. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Alice smiled, her forehead resting against his. "Good." That night, as they sat by the fire in the completed cabin, Henry told her the truth. "I was born to be king of a realm that exists between your world and the wild places," he began, his voice low and measured. "My people are old, older than human civilization. We were the things your ancestors feared in the dark forests, the creatures they built walls to keep out." Alice listened without interruption, her hands folded over her belly where the baby had finally settled into sleep. "For centuries, I ruled justly. I kept the peace between our kind and yours, maintained the boundaries that kept both worlds safe." Henry's jaw tightened. "Then I met her, Lydia. She was human, like you. Beautiful, brave, stubborn as hell. You loved her. I worshipped her." The pain in his voice was fresh as an open wound. "I gave up everything for her. My crown, my people, my birthright. We fled to the mortal world, thinking we could build a life together. What happened? My brother Julian happened." Henry's eyes blazed with old fury. He'd always coveted the throne, always resented that I was born first. When I abdicated, he took power, but it wasn't enough. He wanted me dead, wanted to ensure I could never return to challenge his rule. Alice felt ice forming in her stomach. He killed her. He sent assassins, corrupted ones like the creatures that attacked you. Henry's hands clenched into fists. They tore her apart while I was away hunting. I came home to find... He stopped, unable to finish. "Henry." Alice reached for him, her fingers closing over his fisted hands. "I've been running ever since, hiding. Julian's reach is long, and his hatred runs deep. He won't stop until I'm dead." Henry looked at her with desperate intensity. "That's why you can't stay with me, Alice. Why this?" He gestured between them. "Can't happen. Everyone I love dies." Alice was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd told her. The supernatural world he described should have terrified her, sent her running into the night. Instead, all she felt was a deep, aching sympathy for this man who'd lost everything. "How long ago?" she asked finally. 50 years, maybe 60. Time blurs when you're alone." "And you've been alone all this time?" Henry nodded. "It's safer that way." Alice stood slowly, her hands pressed to her lower back. She moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered clearing where Henry had built her sanctuary. In the distance, the mountains rose like sleeping giants against the star-filled sky. "I was married before," she said quietly, "to a good man who loved me, who wanted to give me everything. We had plans, a farm in Kansas, children, a quiet life." She turned back to Henry. "He died of fever 3 months after we wed. I was already carrying his child." Henry's expression softened. "Alice, I came west because I couldn't bear to stay where everything reminded me of him. I thought if I could just get far enough away, build something new, maybe I could outrun the grief." Alice laughed softly. "Turns out you can't outrun anything. It follows you wherever you go." "That's why you have to leave," Henry said urgently. "Before Julian finds us, before—" "No." Alice's voice was firm. "I'm tired of running, Henry. Tired of being afraid. You saved my life, built me a home, showed me kindness when I needed it most. I'm not abandoning you just because your past is complicated. You don't understand. Julian isn't just dangerous. He's evil. He corrupts everything he touches, turns beauty into nightmare. If he finds you with me, then we'll face him together." Alice moved back to the fire, settling beside Henry on the rough wooden bench he'd built. "I'm not some delicate flower that wilts at the first sign of trouble. I've buried a husband, traveled 1,000 miles alone while pregnant, and survived an attack by monsters. I think I can handle one more challenge." Henry stared at her as if she were something miraculous. "You're not afraid?" "Terrified," Alice admitted. "But not of you. Never of you." Henry's hand found hers in the firelight, his fingers warm and strong. "I don't deserve you." "Good thing that's not your choice to make." Alice smiled at him, her heart full of something she'd thought lost forever. "Besides, this baby needs a father. You interested in the job?" The hope that bloomed in Henry's eyes was beautiful and heartbreaking. "Alice, think about it," she said, squeezing his hand. "No pressure." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the stone hearth Henry had built with his own hands. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and pine sap and the promise of winter storms to come. But inside their cabin, wrapped in warmth and newfound hope, Alice felt safe for the first time since Thomas died. She was drifting off to sleep against Henry's shoulder when he stiffened beside her. "What is it?" she asked, instantly alert. Henry's nostrils flared, his head tilted as if listening to something she couldn't hear. A scent. Familiar. His eyes began to glow with that otherworldly light. Impossible. He can't have found us so quickly. Who? But Alice already knew. Julian. Henry was on his feet, moving toward the window with predatory grace. He's close. Very close. Alice struggled to stand, one hand pressed to her belly. How close? Henry's face went pale in the firelight. Close enough to smell the smoke from our chimney. Outside, something howled in the distance. Not quite wolf, not quite human. It was answered by another call, then another, until the mountains rang with inhuman voices. Henry spun toward Alice, his face desperate. "The back room. Now! There's a root cellar beneath the floorboards. I'm not hiding while you—" "Alice, please." Henry's hands framed her face, his touch gentle despite the urgency in his voice. "I can't fight him and protect you at the same time. I need to know you're safe." The howls were getting closer. Alice could hear something moving through the trees now, branches snapping under heavy feet. Multiple somethings. "Promise me," Henry said fiercely. "Promise me you'll stay hidden no matter what you hear." Alice wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him and face whatever was coming. But the baby kicked hard against her ribs, reminding her that she wasn't just risking her own life. "I promise," she whispered. Henry kissed her then, hard and desperate, pouring everything he couldn't say into the press of his lips against hers. When he pulled away, his eyes were blazing with inhuman light. "I love you," he said simply. "I need you to know that." Before Alice could respond, the howls stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. Henry's head snapped toward the door. Every muscle in his body coiled for violence. "Go," he whispered. "Now." Alice stumbled toward the back room, her heart threatening to beat out of her chest. She found the hidden trapdoor Henry had mentioned, pulled it open, and lowered herself into the cramped space beneath the floorboards. Above her, she could hear Henry moving around the cabin, preparing for battle. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then, soft as a whisper, came the sound of footsteps on the front porch. Deliberate, confident. The footsteps of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Alice pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle her breathing. Through the floorboards, she heard the front door creak open. No knock, no announcement. Just the slow, measured sound of boots on wooden planks. "Hello, brother." The voice was cultured, refined, with just a hint of an accent Alice couldn't place. "You've built yourself quite the little love nest." Henry's response was a low growl that made the floorboards vibrate. "Julian, did you really think you could hide from me forever? That I wouldn't eventually catch the scent of the exiled prince?" Julian's laugh was like breaking glass. And with a human woman, no less. How deliciously predictable. Alice heard movement above, careful, circling like predators sizing each other up. "She has nothing to do with this," Henry said, his voice deadly quiet. "This is between us." "Oh, but she has everything to do with this." Julian's footsteps moved closer to where Alice was hidden. "You see, I've learned so much about you over the years, dear brother. Your weaknesses, your patterns. You always did have a soft spot for broken things. Leave her out of this." "I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, killing you isn't enough anymore. I want you to suffer first. I want you to feel the same agony I felt watching you throw away everything our family built for some mortal whore." The temperature in the cabin dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Alice's breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the wooden beams above her head. Through the floorboards, she could see pale light beginning to seep through the cracks, the glow of supernatural power unleashed. "You want me?" Henry's voice was changing, becoming something inhuman. "Then take me, but leave her alone." "Where's the fun in that?" Julian's laughter was like ice cracking. "Besides, I can smell her terror. It's quite intoxicating." Alice bit down on her knuckle to keep from crying out. The baby was kicking frantically now, responding to her fear. Above her, the confrontation was escalating. She could hear furniture being thrown, the sound of claws on wood, inhuman snarls that made her blood freeze. Then suddenly, silence. "Ah," Julian said pleasantly. "There she is." Alice's blood turned to ice. Through a gap in the floorboards, she could see a pale eye looking down at her, glowing with malevolent intelligence. "Hello, little mother," Julian purred. "Why don't you come up and join us? I promise to make this quick." The floorboard above her head exploded in a shower of splinters. A hand reached down, pale, elegant, tipped with claws like black razors. Alice scrambled backward in the cramped space, but there was nowhere to go. Julian's shadow fell across the doorstep as he leaned down toward her hiding place, his smile full of teeth and terrible promise. "Found you," he whispered. Alice's scream died in her throat as Henry's roar shook the entire cabin. The pale hand reaching for her vanished as Julian was torn away from the opening, his elegant composure shattered by 200 pounds of fury slamming into him. The floorboards above her head groaned and splintered under the impact of their collision. She heard Julian's surprised snarl, then the crash of bodies against the stone hearth. Sparks flew through the gaps in the floorboards, and Alice pressed herself against the earthen wall of her hiding place, one hand clutched protectively over her belly. The baby had gone still, as if sensing the danger above. "Still protecting your pets, I see." Julian's voice was strained now, no longer the cultured purr it had been moments before. "Some things never change." Henry's response was wordless, a sound that belonged to no human throat. Alice could smell blood now, metallic and sharp, mixing with the scent of pine smoke and something else. Something cold and wrong that made her skin crawl. The battle raged above her with inhuman speed and violence. She caught glimpses through the floorboard gaps, flashes of movement too quick to follow, claws raking across wooden walls, furniture exploding into splinters. The cabin Henry had built with such care was being torn apart around them. Then Julian's voice cut through the chaos, honey-sweet and terrible. "Tell me, brother, does she know what you really are? What you're capable of when the hunger takes hold?" "Shut up." Henry's voice was raw, desperate. "Does she know about the villages? The innocence you drained dry before you learned control?" Julian's laughter was like breaking glass. "Oh, she doesn't, does she? How delicious." Alice felt something cold settle in her chest. Villages. Innocence. The words echoed in the cramped space around her, painting pictures she didn't want to see. But even as doubt tried to take root, she remembered Henry's gentle hands on her face, the way he'd caught her when she fell, the careful reverence with which he'd touched her. Above her, the fighting intensified. She heard Henry cry out, pain, not rage, and something wet dripped through the floorboards onto her upturned face. Blood. His blood. "Getting slow in your old age," Julian taunted. "Soft living with your human whore has made you weak." The temperature plummeted further. Alice's breath came in sharp puffs, and ice began forming on the wooden beams. Through the gaps, she could see pale light growing brighter, casting everything in stark, cold relief. "I'm going to kill her slowly," Julian continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Make you watch while I drain every drop of life from her body. Then I'll take the child, raise it as my own. Wouldn't that be fitting?" The threat hit Alice like a physical blow. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, where Thomas's child grew strong and safe. The child Henry had promised to protect. The child Julian wanted to steal. Something shifted inside her then. Not fear, but fury. Pure maternal rage that burned away everything else. She'd lost Thomas, She'd lost her home, her plans, her safe and predictable future. She would not lose this child. Not to Julian. Not to anyone. Alice pressed her palms against the floorboards above her head and pushed. The wood, weakened by the supernatural cold and the violence of the fight, gave way with a sharp crack. She hauled herself up through the opening, splinters catching at her dress, her hair, her skin. The main room of the cabin was a disaster. Furniture overturned, walls gouged with claw marks, the carefully built hearth cracked and smoking. Henry and Julian were locked together near the shattered remains of the front door, moving too fast for her to follow. But she could see Henry was losing. Blood ran from a dozen wounds, and his movements were growing sluggish while Julian seemed untouched, elegant even in violence. Alice's gaze fell on the iron poker beside the ruined hearth. Heavy, solid, real in a way that nothing else in this supernatural nightmare seemed to be. She grabbed it, the metal cold against her palms, and stepped forward. Julian. Both brothers froze at the sound of her voice. Julian's head turned toward her, his pale eyes widening in surprise and delight. The little mother joins us at last. How? Alice swung the poker with every ounce of strength in her body. The iron caught Julian across the temple with a sound like a bell tolling. He staggered backward, his perfect features twisting in shock and pain. Black blood welled from the wound, steaming in the cold air. "Iron?" he hissed, pressing one elegant hand to his head. Clever little thing, but Alice wasn't done. The rage burning in her chest had found its voice, and she advanced on Julian with the poker raised like a weapon. "You want to hurt my child? You want to take what's mine?" Julian laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now. "What exactly do you think you can do to me, mortal?" "This." Alice swung again, catching him across the ribs. Julian doubled over with a sound of genuine pain, and she brought the poker down on his shoulder, then his back, each blow fueled by months of grief and fear and desperate love. Iron might not kill him, but it hurt. She could see it in the way he flinched, the way his supernatural grace abandoned him. For the first time since entering their home, Julian looked less than perfectly in control. "Enough!" Julian's roar shook the cabin walls. Power exploded outward from him, sending Alice flying backward. She hit the wall hard, the poker spinning from her hands, and slid to the floor, gasping. But her attack had given Henry the opening he needed. While Julian was focused on Alice, Henry struck, not with claws or fangs, but with something else. Something that made the air itself sing with power. Alice watched in awe as Henry straightened to his full height, and for the first time she saw him as he truly was. Not just the gentle man who'd built her a home, not just the exile running from his past, but a king. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, ancient and terrible and magnificent. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "You forget yourself, brother. You forget what I am." Julian's face went pale. "You abdicated. You gave up the right. I gave up the throne. I never gave up what I was born to be." Henry's eyes blazed like stars, and Alice could feel the power building around him, pressing against her skin like an approaching storm. "I am Henry Blackthorne, first of his line, rightful king of the Winter Court, and you are trespassing in my domain." The temperature in the cabin shifted. Not the killing cold Julian had brought, but something else. Something that felt like the first breath of spring after a long winter, sharp and clean and full of promise. Alice realized she was holding her breath. Julian took a step backward, his confidence finally cracking. You can't. You're in exile. The old laws. The old laws state that a king's authority extends to any land he claims as his own. Henry's smile was sharp as a blade. Any land where he builds a home, where he protects what is his. Alice felt her heart stop. His. Henry was claiming her, claiming their child, claiming this little cabin in the wilderness as his kingdom. And somehow, impossibly, she could feel the land itself responding to his words. The mountains, the forest, the very air seemed to acknowledge his authority. This is my domain now, Henry continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. My land, my people, my family. His gaze flicked to Alice, and the love in his eyes was fierce enough to burn. And you are not welcome here. The power that exploded from Henry was like nothing Alice had ever experienced. It didn't hurt, not her, but she watched Julian scream as it washed over him. The usurper, king, crumpled to his knees, his perfect features twisting in agony. Please, Julian gasped. Brother, please. You are no brother of mine. Henry's voice was implacable. You forfeited that right when you murdered Lydia, when you threatened Alice, when you came into my home and threatened my child. Julian's form began to waver, becoming translucent. Alice realized Henry wasn't killing him. He was banishing him, sending him away with the full force of royal authority behind the command. You cannot hide from me forever, Julian snarled as his body faded. I will find you again. I will— No, Henry said simply. You won't. The last thing Alice saw of Julian was his hate-filled eyes, promising vengeance even as he vanished like smoke. Then there was only silence, broken by the soft crackle of the dying fire and Henry's labored breathing. Alice struggled to her feet, one hand pressed to her belly where the baby was kicking frantically. Henry stood in the center of their ruined home, power still radiating from him like heat, his dark hair wild and his clothes torn. Blood ran from a dozen wounds, but he was alive. They were alive. Is he gone? She asked quietly. Henry nodded, some of the otherworldly glow fading from his eyes. For now. The banishment will hold as long as I maintain my claim on this land. And how long is that? Henry's smile was soft, human again. As long as you'll have me. Alice looked around at their destroyed cabin, the overturned furniture, the cracked walls, the shattered windows that let in the cold mountain air. It should have been devastating. Instead, all she felt was relief. They were alive. They were together. Everything else could be rebuilt. Well, she said, trying for lightness despite the tremor in her voice. I suppose we have some work to do. Henry crossed to her in 3 quick strides, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. Alice, I'm sorry. I should have told you everything from the beginning. About Julian, about what I've done, about the villages? Alice met his gaze steadily. About the people you killed before you learned control? Henry's face went white. You heard. I heard. Alice reached up to cover his hands with her own. I also heard you defend me. Saw you claim this place as your kingdom just to keep us safe. Watched you banish your own brother to protect a woman and child who aren't even yours. You are mine, Henry said fiercely. Both of you, if you'll have me. Alice felt tears prick her eyes. Henry Blackthorne, first of his line, rightful king of the Winter Court, she said solemnly. Are you asking me to marry you? Henry's laugh was shaky with relief. I'm asking you to be my queen. That's quite a promotion from frontier widow. Alice smiled up at him. What makes you think I'm qualified? You faced down an immortal king with an iron poker to protect your child, Henry said seriously. I'd say you're overqualified. Alice laughed, the sound bright and clear in the ruined cabin. In that case, yes. I'll be your queen. But first, she winced as the baby delivered a particularly sharp kick. I think we need to rebuild our palace, and maybe find a midwife. This little one seems eager to meet his or her royal father. Henry's eyes went wide. Now? The baby's coming now? Not this very moment, Alice assured him, though another wave of pressure low in her belly made her less certain. But soon, very soon. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Henry worked with supernatural speed to make the cabin livable again, boarding up the broken windows, righting the overturned furniture, getting the fire burning bright and warm. Alice tried to help, but the contractions were coming stronger now, stealing her breath and making her grip the back of a chair until her knuckles went white. The bed, Henry said, appearing at her side as another contraction peaked. You should lie down. I can't. I need to move. Alice paced the small space, one hand pressed to her lower back. Walking helps. Henry hovered nearby, looking more terrified than he had facing Julian. Should I? Is there something I should do? Someone I should fetch? There's no one to fetch, Alice reminded him gently. It's just us. The reality of that hit them both at the same time. No doctor, no midwife, no experienced woman to guide them through what was coming. Just Alice, who had never given birth before, and Henry, who despite his centuries of life had never attended a human childbirth. I don't know how to do this, Henry admitted, his voice raw with worry. Alice caught his hand as another contraction built. Neither do I. We'll figure it out together. They did, somehow. Henry proved surprisingly capable once he got over his initial panic, following Alice's instincts and doing whatever she needed. He held her when the pain got too intense, helped her walk when she needed to move, brought her water when her throat went dry. As dawn light began to filter through the boarded windows, Alice felt the final, overwhelming urge to push. She gripped Henry's hands, drawing strength from his steady presence, and brought their child into the world with a cry that echoed off the cabin walls. The baby's first wail was strong and indignant, filling the small space with the sound of new life. Henry's hands shook as he helped Alice deliver the tiny, perfect form, a daughter, red-faced and furious at being evicted from her warm nest. She's beautiful, Henry whispered, his voice thick with wonder. Perfect. Alice cradled the baby against her chest, tears streaming down her face. The little girl had Thomas's dark hair but Alice's stubborn chin, and when she opened her eyes, they were the clear blue of a mountain sky. Hello, little one, Alice murmured, pressing a kiss to the downy head. You certainly know how to make an entrance. Henry reached out, tentatively, one finger stroking the baby's tiny fist. What will you call her? Alice looked up at him, this impossible man who had become her salvation, her partner, her king. Hope, she said simply. Her name is Hope. Henry's smile was radiant. Hope Blackthorn. It has a nice ring to it. You want to claim her as yours? If you'll let me. Henry's voice was soft, uncertain. I know she's not my blood, but she's ours, Alice said firmly. Blood doesn't make a family, Henry. Love does. Henry leaned down to press a gentle kiss to Alice's forehead, then another to Hope's tiny head. My queen, he murmured. My daughter. My family. Alice felt something settle in her chest, a peace she hadn't known since Thomas died. This wasn't the life she'd planned, the safe and predictable future she'd dreamed of. It was something far more dangerous, far more uncertain. It was also something far more wonderful. As the sun climbed higher, warming the cabin with golden light, Alice dozed with hope in her arms. Henry sat beside them on the rebuilt bed, one protective arm around them both, watching over his new family with fierce devotion. The cabin walls bore scars from the battle, claw marks that would never fully sand away, burn marks from Julian's cold fire, boards that didn't quite match where Henry had made hasty repairs. But it was solid, warm, safe, a fortress built not just of wood and stone, but of love and determination and the unshakable will to protect what mattered most. Alice stirred as Hope began to fuss, the baby's tiny mouth rooting against her chest. As she settled the child to nurse, she caught Henry watching them with an expression of such profound contentment that it took her breath away. "No regrets?" she asked softly. Henry's smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "How could I regret finding my purpose? My home?" He traced one gentle finger along Hope's cheek. "My family." Outside, the wind whispered through the pine boughs, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke and the promise of spring still months away. But inside their small fortress, wrapped in warmth and new love and the fierce protection of a king who had finally found his kingdom, Alice felt nothing but peace. The baby's contented sighs mixed with the crackle of the fire. Henry tended so carefully, and Alice closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the simple miracle of this moment. She had come west, running from grief, carrying nothing but loss and the desperate hope of starting over. Instead, she had found a king without a kingdom, and together they had built something neither could have imagined alone. Not just a home, but a dynasty. Not just survival, but a love story that would echo through the mountains for generations to come. As sleep claimed her, Alice's last conscious thought was of the warmth surrounding her, Henry's solid presence, Hope's tiny body against her chest, the steady heat of the fire that would never be allowed to die. She had been so cold when she first arrived in this wilderness, frozen through with loss and fear. Now she would never be cold again.